Yesterday, when asked about reparations, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell offered a familiar reply. America should not be held liable for something that happened 150 years ago, since none of us currently alive are responsible. This rebuttal proffers a strange theory of governance, that American accounts are somehow bound by the lifetime of its generations. But well into this century, the United States was still paying out pensions to the heirs of Civil War soldiers. We honor treaties that date back some 200 years, despite no one being alive who signed those treaties. Many of us would love to be taxed for the things we are solely and individually responsible for. But we are American citizens, and thus bound to a collective enterprise that extends beyond our individual and personal reach. It would seem ridiculous to dispute invocations of the founders or the greatest generation on the basis of a lack of membership in either group. We recognize our lineage as a generational trust, as inheritance. And the real dilemma posed by reparations is just that, a dilemma of inheritance. It is impossible to imagine America without the inheritance of slavery. As historian Ed Baptist has written, enslavement, quote, shaped every crucial aspect of the economy and politics of America, so that by 1836, more than 600 million, or almost half of the economic activity in the United States, derived directly or indirectly from the cotton produced by the million-odd slaves. By the time the enslaved were emancipated, they comprised the largest single asset in America, $3 billion in $1860, more than all the other assets in the country combined. The method of cultivating this asset was neither gentle cajoling nor persuasion, but torture, rape, and child trafficking. Enslavement reigned for 250 years on these shores. When it ended, this country could have extended its hallowed principles, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all regardless of color. But America had other principles in mind. And so for a century after the Civil War, black people were subjected to a relentless campaign of terror, a campaign that extended well into the lifetime of Majority Leader McConnell. It is tempting to divorce this modern campaign of terror, of plunder, from enslavement. But the logic of enslavement, of white supremacy, respects no such borders. And the god of bondage was lustful and begat many heirs: coup d'etats and convict leasing, vagrancy laws and debt peonage, redlining and racist GI bills, poll taxes and state-sponsored terrorism. We grant that Mr. McConnell was not alive for Appomattox, but he was alive for the electrocution of George Stinney. He was alive for the blinding of Isaac Woodward. He was alive to witness kleptocracy in his native Alabama and a regime premised on electoral theft. Majority Leader McConnell cited civil rights legislation yesterday, as well he should, because he was alive to witness the harassment, jailing, and betrayal of those responsible for that legislation by a government sworn to protect them. He was alive for the redlining of Chicago and the looting of black homeowners of some $4 billion. Victims of that plunder are very much alive today. I am sure they'd love a word with the Majority Leader. What they know, what this committee must know, is that while emancipation deadbolted the door against the bandits of America, Jim Crow wedged the windows wide open. And that is the thing about Senator McConnell's something. It was 150 years ago, and it was right now. The typical black family in this country has 1/10 the wealth of the typical white family. Black women die in childbirth at 4 times the rate of white women. And there is, of course, the shame of this land of the free, boasting the largest prison population on the planet, of which the descendants of the enslaved make up the largest share. The matter of reparations is one of making amends and direct redress, but it is also a question of citizenship. In H.R. 40, this body has a chance to both make good on its 2009 apology for enslavement and reject fair-weather patriotism, to say that a nation is both its credits and its debits, that if Thomas Jefferson matters, so does Sally Hemings, that if D-Day matters, so does Black Wall Street, that if Valley Forge matters, so does Fort Pillow. Because the question really is not whether we will be tied to the somethings of our past, but whether we are courageous enough to be tied to the whole of them. Thank you.
Appreciate your attendance, and you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee. It's an honor to testify on a topic as important as this one. Nothing I'm about to say is meant to minimize the horror and brutality of slavery and Jim Crow. Racism is a bloody stain on this country's history, and I consider our failure to pay reparations directly to freed slaves after the Civil War to be one of the greatest injustices ever perpetrated by the U.S. government. But I worry that our desire to fix the past compromises our ability to fix the present. Think about what we're doing today. We're spending our time debating a bill that mentions slavery 25 times, but incarceration only once, in an era with no black slaves, but nearly 1 million black prisoners. A bill that doesn't mention homicide once, at a time when the Center for Disease Control reports homicide as the #1 cause of death for young black men. I'm not saying that acknowledging history doesn't matter. It does. I'm saying there's a difference between acknowledging history and allowing history to distract us from the problems we face today. In 2008, the House of Representatives formally apologized for slavery and Jim Crow. In 2009, the Senate did the same. Black people don't need another apology. We need safer neighborhoods and better schools. We need a less punitive criminal justice system. We need affordable health care. And none of these things can be achieved through reparations for slavery. Nearly everyone close to me told me not to testify today. They told me that even though I've only ever voted for Democrats, I'd be perceived as a Republican and therefore hated by half the country. Others told me that by distancing myself from Republicans, I would end up angering the other half of the country. And the sad truth is that they were both right. That's how suspicious we've become of one another. That's how divided we are as a nation. If we were to pay reparations today, we would only divide the country further, making it harder to build the political coalitions required to solve the problems facing black people today. We would insult many black Americans by putting a price on the suffering of their ancestors. And we would turn the relationship between black Americans and white Americans from a coalition into a transaction, from a union between citizens into a lawsuit between plaintiffs and defendants. What we should do is pay reparations to black Americans who actually grew up under Jim Crow and were directly harmed by second-class citizenship, people like my grandparents. But paying reparations to all descendants of slaves is a mistake. Take me, for example. I was born 3 decades after the end of Jim Crow into a privileged household in the suburbs. I attend an Ivy League school. Yet I'm also descended from slaves who worked on Thomas Jefferson's Monticello plantation. So reparations for slavery would allocate federal resources to me, but not to an American with the wrong ancestry, even if that person is living paycheck to paycheck and working multiple jobs to support a family. You might call that justice. I call it justice for the dead at the price of justice for the living. I understand that reparations are about what people are owed, regardless of how well they're doing. I understand that. But the people who are owed for slavery are no longer here, and we're not entitled to collect on their debts. Reparations, by definition, are only given to victims. So the moment you give me reparations, you've made me into a victim without my consent. Not just that, you've made 1/3 of black Americans who poll against reparations into victims without their consent. And black Americans have fought too long for the right to define themselves, to be spoken for in such a condescending manner. The question is not what America owes me by virtue of my ancestry. The question is what all Americans owe each other by virtue of being citizens of the same nation. And the obligation of citizenship is not transactional. It's not contingent on ancestry. It never expires, and it can't be paid off. For all these reasons, Bill H.R. 40 is a moral and political mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Chill, 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 chill. He was presumptive, but he still has a right to speak.
Thank you, Chairman Cohen. I think the most obvious reason is because the federal government is complicit in it. The article that you spoke about, this period of white supremacy that you referenced in the headline, it is so broad that if I tried to cover it in one article, it would have been impossible. So I focused on a very specific thing, and that is the period of Jim Crow and housing segregation and redlining, specifically in the city of Chicago. The federal government should pay because the federal government was deeply complicit in housing segregation and redlining and in the plunder of black homeowners in Chicago. It would not have existed if the FHA had not had a policy of not insuring loans for black people living in Chicago. It would not have existed if not for the redlining maps, which were written and created by this government of every major city in the country, which effectively relegated black people, whether they had a down payment or not, outside of a class of people who could benefit from a movement which basically created our modern middle class. And so I don't know how it would be possible to exempt the federal government from such a process. And furthermore, I have to make this point over and over. Many of the people who were victimized by housing segregation and by redlining are very much alive today. So this is not strictly about the past. This is identifiable victims, as Professor Miller said, who are there and who are ready to be part of the process.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you to all of you for your time and your heartfelt sentiments, and we know they're sincere. Mr. Hughes, I want to thank you for your honesty and your humility and your courage, sir. I know this isn't easy today. Here's a big question that hangs over all this and that all of us need to, I guess, address. Look, many people believe, on all sides of the political spectrum, that racial inequality that we see today is not entirely attributable to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. It's a factor, but it's not entirely attributable. Can you elaborate on what some of the other causative factors may be?
Well, the first thing I would say is that blaming slavery and Jim Crow for the entirety of racial disparity, obviously it's clearly a factor, but blaming it for the entirety of the problems we see today facing black people is actually a way of not taking responsibility for policy decisions that were made just in the last 50 years. Our prisons did not balloon until the 1980s. Unemployment for black and white youths were virtually identical until the late 1950s and early 1960s. So perversely, by blaming slavery and Jim Crow for everything, we actually fail to take responsibility for policy decisions that were made on both sides of the aisle in very recent history. Secondly, I would say that there is a naive assumption that wherever there is a statistical gap in outcomes between two groups, that gap must be attributable to some kind of discrimination, whether that's overt or whether that's structural and systemic. That assumption is not true. Okay, I'll give one example, but I could give dozens. According to 2015 census figures, there's a 21 cent on the dollar gap. It's 21 cents on the dollar gap in household income between white Americans of Russian descent and white Americans of French descent, right? Disparity is the norm, not the exception. So the question is not why two groups would have different outcomes, whether it's for wealth, income, or incarceration. The question is why we would expect any two groups with different histories, different geographical patterns, different patterns of migration, different cultures, to nevertheless get exactly the same outcomes.
So first of all, one of the things I tried to make clear in my testimony is that we perceive the era of enslavement, the era of Jim Crow, and in fact, I would actually even add the era of mass incarceration as separate things that are somehow not tied to each other. The greatest damage that enslavement did, besides the economic damage, besides the normalization of torture, of rape, besides the normalization of treating people as though they are things, is the institution in the American mind that black people are necessarily inferior. In 1865, when black people were emancipated, that belief did not magically dissipate. It proceeded for 100 years afterwards. It proceeded, as I said in my testimony, well into the lifetime of many panel members, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and then many of the people who are here in this audience. And so it's not a matter of the past. These things are linked. It's been said, I think, or alluded to repeatedly throughout this conversation that somehow wealthy African Americans are immune to these effects. But in addition to the wealth gap that's cited, one thing that folks should keep in mind is that quote-unquote wealthy African Americans are not the equivalent of quote-unquote wealthy white Americans in this country. The average African American family in this country making $100,000, which is, decent money, actually lives in the same kind of neighborhood that the average white family making $35,000 a year lives in. That is totally tied to the legacy of enslavement and Jim Crow, and the input and the idea in the mind that white people and black people are somehow deserving of different things. If I injure you, the injury persists even after I actually commit the act. If I stab you, you may suffer complications long after that initial actual stabbing. If I shoot you, you may suffer complications long after that initial shooting. That's the case with African Americans. There are people well within the living memory of this country that are still suffering from the after effects of that.
Thank you very much for their remarks. Mr. Hughes, I wanted to ask if there was anything that was said previously that you'd like to respond to.
I'd like to address myself to the comments made on the subject of us not knowing our history, of us not having told the truth about slavery and Jim Crow. It strikes me that this is not exactly true. Mr. Glover mentioned all of the studies and books that have been written on the subject. I would argue, in fact, that in the 10,000-year history of slavery on every continent, there is not a single example of slavery that has been more studied than slavery in America from the 17th century to the 19th century. So it is actually not true that we have not told the truth, that we don't know our history. Moreover, in the past 50 years, if we're talking about what scholars in America, in the American social sciences, have directed their attention towards, it is hard to find a subject on which more books have been written that has been more studied than racial inequality. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I think my fellow panel member is quite correct that at this moment in history, it's certainly true that the system of enslavement in America has probably been the most studied in America. That's not particularly surprising, given the extensive and revolutionary and wide system of universities we have in this country, which is also probably unprecedented and also probably a new development also. But I think even given that, it's worth noting the lack of penetration that those studies have had into the American mindset. I don't know if it's still here, but relatively recently there was a statue garden here in the Capitol that I believe had statues of General Lee and Alexander Stephens, and one has to ask if in the Capitol people understood the history of this country, why there would be statues honoring people who led a revolution to destroy it. One would have to ask, if that history were well understood, why in, for instance, the state of Mississippi there still was a flag flying dedicated to people who tried to destroy this country. Why only a couple of years ago we saw the murder of Heather Heyer, and that was precipitated by a movement to erect a new group of statues and remove the statue of General Lee. And so while it's been well studied, I don't know that Americans quite understand it. At this very point, you can get at least a plurality of white Americans who will tell you that the Civil War was about states' rights, with no conversation about states' rights to do what. In terms of the differences in approach today, what I would say is that's why we need H.R. 40. That's exactly what we're here to discuss in the first place. I'm very skeptical of the notion that one person should stand up and speak for 40 million African Americans, that one person should stand up and speak for all the generations that came before me. I think the proper thing to do is, A, for this body to convene a committee and convene a discussion to study exactly what the damage was and what potential remedy might be offered, and also to convene conversations around the country. Just attendant to that, I also would like to say there's been a lot of, shall we say, shade throwing on the notion of cutting checks. I just want to say, in the spirit of openness, in the spirit of actual study, I don't think we should necessarily rule out cutting checks. There are people who deserve checks. And so, and I think that actually should be part of the study. We aren't ruling out any solution. I don't think we should rule out that one either.
To Mr. Hughes for a moment, in spite of your relative young age, you've had some valuable experience publicly discussing sensitive issues of race and culture, and I just wonder what advice you would give to young people who are thinking about this. As Mr. Owen said, everybody ought to let that marinate a little bit. As they begin to think about it, it's been suggested this morning that ignorance of our history is a big part of this, that everybody across the country, I mean, in large numbers, we suffer from that. What's the response, and what advice do you give to young people?
Well, I would urge people to observe the distinction between understanding history and responding to history. You can understand history, and it can still be the case that you have a range of possible responses in front of you. So addressing myself to Mr. Coates' comments before, if I understand them, the idea is if we really understood our history, then we wouldn't keep Confederate statues up, for example. Therefore, the fact that they're still up implies that we don't really understand it in our bones. And that I think, highlights a distinction between how I think about this issue and how other people on the panel think about it. For example, there was a poll in the Washington Post last year which found that 30% of black Virginians wanted the Confederate statues to stay up. Now, I don't think they wanted that because they hated themselves. I don't think they wanted that because they didn't understand their own history. Perhaps they were people who just didn't like seeing their communities change. There are many people like that. And I respect that, even though I myself would be fine to see those statues come down. So the point here is that our response, whether or not you agree with it, is not itself evidence that we don't understand our history. And we can have two separate conversations. One is what happened in this country, what was done to black people, what harm was incurred. And the second conversation is what do we do about that? And that second conversation the answer to that second conversation is not self-evident from the answer to the first. Thank you.
15 seconds, let me give me one more question you can answer it, I hope. You wrote an article a while back entitled Black American Culture and the Racial Wealth Gap, and you talked about, specifically, the city of Boston, and there was a disparity within the black community, and you've pointed out that black Bostonians of American ancestry had a median household wealth of $8 in that, but Caribbean ancestry had $12,000 of wealth. It talks to the disparity. I just wonder if you'd comment on the implications of that.
Well, this just goes back to the point I made before about disparities even within races being normal. So if you look at census figures for white Americans and break it down, instead of talking about quote-unquote white people, into white people of French ancestry, Russian ancestry, Swedish ancestry, you will find all kinds of disparities that by definition cannot be caused by some kind of systemic discrimination. Likewise, with quote-unquote black Americans, it's a very diverse group. Something like 10% of black people in this country are immigrants from places like Jamaica, Haiti, Nigeria, Ghana. And if you look at each individual group, you will find various disparities in wealth, in income, in crime rates that by definition can't be explained by either race or racism. So my point in citing that disparity is to upset the notion that if society were fair, evidence of that would be equal outcomes between all groups, because there are so many differences historically in groups themselves, geographically, just in terms of median age, right? The average black person in this country is 10 years younger than the average white person. So when you're comparing blacks to whites, that's just one of the many ways in which you're not actually comparing apples to apples. So my point in citing that was just to upset that lazy assumption that we make about socioeconomic and other outcomes.